When the topic of maritime disasters is raised, many people will think of the sinking of the Titanic. This is a tragedy that's been immortalised in film repeatedly in the 112 years since this disaster. However, the 1,496 souls lost during the Titanic's fateful first and last voyage is eclipsed by an event which occurred in the final months of World War II, when the transport ship Wilhelm Gustloff was torpedoed by a Soviet submarine whilst carrying thousands of people, including women and children, who were trying to flee the relentless march of the Red Army. This tragedy claimed the lives of over 9,000 people, and is still the single greatest loss of life in a single ship sinking in history. Welcome to Tales of Tragedy. Today, for this tale, we travel back to 1945 and to the last months of World War II, with our focus being a ship, the Wilhelm Gustloff, which was constructed by the company Blohm & Voss at their shipyard near Hamburg. It measured 208 metres long by 23 metres wide and weighed around 25,000 tonnes. It was meant to be named after Adolf Hitler, but was instead named the Wilhelm Gustloff after the leader of the Swiss Nazi Party, who had been assassinated in 1936. It was launched on the 5th of May 1937, with Hitler attending the ceremony. Initially, it was built as a propaganda tool. It served as a cruise liner for German workers and dignitaries, and on-board concerts and plays were held, whilst the ship transported those aboard on exotic holidays. The smiling faces of the passengers were used as a way to portray a more wholesome image of the Third Reich to the rest of Germany and the world. However, at the outbreak of World War II, the Wilhelm Gustloff, like almost all ships of its size, was repurposed for the war effort. From September 1939 to November 1940, it served as a hospital ship, but from the 20th of November 1940, she was moored off the coast of Gotenhafen, modern-day Gdynia, a city in northern Poland, acting as a barracks for submarine crews in the region. Wilhelm Gustloff remained moored there for 4 years, but was remobilised as part of Operation Hannibal. This was one of the largest evacuations by sea in modern history, undertaken by the German Navy, to evacuate German troops and civilians, predominantly from the area of East Prussia, due to the relentless march of the Red Army on their way to Berlin. Every ship was mobilised as a means of transport, with the intention being to relocate the passengers to ports in West Germany. On Tuesday the 30th of January 1945, the Wilhelm Gustloff was anchored at the port of Gotenhafen, loading passengers. The dock area was jammed with terrified civilians, wounded soldiers, and horse-drawn wagons which had been used by families to transport themselves, their loved ones, and everything they owned in the hope of gaining passage on the ship. A crew member on board later estimated that there were around 60,000 people on the dock. Daily bombing raids along the shore reinforced the impending arrival of the Red Army and increased the terror of those desperate to escape. At 1 p.m, the Gustloff cast off. At this point, there were 6,050 people on board, including 918 German naval officers and men, 373 women's naval auxiliaries, 162 wounded soldiers, and 4,424 refugees. Soon after the ship began its journey, it was forced to stop when a flotilla of boats carrying refugees surrounded the Gustloff, with the passengers screaming and begging to be let on board. Boarding nets were thrown down, and thousands more people boarded the ship. How many will never be known for sure. Those who boarded at this point were simply ushered on deck. No record was taken of the complete passenger manifest, but it's estimated that when the Gustloff resumed its journey, there were around 10,600 people on board. This was around 2,000 passengers over capacity, and so people crammed into every corner of the ship they could find. No doubt, the passengers of the Gustloff felt that they'd escaped the horrors of the war and were now on their way to a new life of peace. However, within a few hours, around 85% of all those on board would be dead. The route the Gustloff was taking through the Baltic Sea was treacherous, with threats from the sea and the air. To mitigate against aerial threats, the Gustloff had been fitted with anti-aircraft guns, but it was threats from the sea which were the most dangerous. Beneath the waves, Soviet submarines were lurking in the area, looking for opportunities for glory, knowing that if they could sink a German ship, they would be hailed in Moscow with a medal pinned to their chest and possibly dubbed a hero of the Soviet Union. There were also tens of thousands of mines which had been laid over the years, just waiting for a ship to collide with them. To mitigate against this threat, the Gustloff travelled with a convoy. This included another ship filled with civilians, but also 2 torpedo boats. However, one of these developed a mechanical fault and returned to port, so the Gustloff was left with only 1 torpedo boat. The submarine detector sensor on board this ship froze, so essentially the Wilhelm Gustloff was completely defenceless. There were then a series of decisions which would seal the fate of the ship and most of the people on board. There were 4 men on board who were commanding officers in their own right, and they squabbled amongst themselves as to the best course of action. One of these, Lieutenant Commander Wilhelm Zahn, a submariner, advised that the Gustloff should hug the shoreline and remain in shallow waters to avoid enemy submarines whilst running with no lights. However, the captain of the Gustloff itself, Friedrich Petersen, decided to take the ship out to deeper water based on reports that mines along the route he had plotted had been cleared, and German intelligence had stated that no Soviet submarines were operating in the area. It's been reported that Captain Petersen received a mysterious radio message stating there was an incoming German minesweeper convoy in the area, and so, based on this, he ordered that the ship's red and green navigation lights were turned on to avoid a collision. Who this transmission was sent by will likely never be known. Potentially it was a trick to get the Gustloff to reveal its position. If so, it worked. It was now night, and the Wilhelm Gustloff was lit up like a Christmas tree against the black sky. This would not have been a problem if there were no Soviet submarines in the area, but the intelligence was wrong. Unknown to the crew and passengers of the Wilhelm Gustloff, the Soviet submarine S-13, commanded by Captain Alexander Marinesko, was in the Baltic looking for a target when they spotted the running lights of the Gustloff as she was sailing approximately 20 miles off the coast of the town of Libra in Poland. Captain Marinesko later stated that he decided, when he saw the ship, quote, that I would bring the war to them. The submarine had approached the port side of the Gustloff, shadowing it, staying between it and the shore, with the assumption being that anyone watching from the deck of the ship would be looking out to sea for threats and not towards the shoreline, and so they would be less likely to be detected. In preparation for the imminent attack, the crew of S-13 began writing slogans along the side of torpedoes, including, quote, for motherland, for Soviet people, and for Leningrad. At 9:16 p.m, Captain Marinesko ordered the submarine to surface, and from a range of around 1,000 metres, 3 torpedoes were fired at the Gustloff. All 3 hit their target. The first torpedo struck the bow, the second hit the accommodation for the Women's Naval Auxiliary, killing almost all 373 of them in the explosion. The third torpedo hit amidships, destroying the engine room, disabling all power and communications on board. The Gustloff lurched starboard and began listing. Panic ensued. Freezing cold water began flooding the corridors, and people scrambled to get on the deck. There were few lifeboats, only enough for 5,000 people, less than half of those on board. However, only 9 of these could be lowered, as the mechanism holding the other boats in place were frozen. Even those that got into the lifeboats were not safe. The Gustloff was listing so quickly that some of the boats that were lowered smashed into the side of the ship, throwing the passengers into the icy cold water. As well as those who died in the initial torpedo explosions, many died from drowning due to being caught below decks as the ship filled with water. Some people lost their lives from being trampled to death in the panic to get above deck. Others were thrown or jumped into the freezing cold water, which was between -10 to -18 degrees Celsius, where they quickly succumbed to the cold and drowned. Those who were wearing life jackets eventually died of exposure in the freezing water. At approximately 9:58 p.m, 40 minutes after being struck, the Wilhelm Gustloff listed onto its side and 10 minutes later disappeared beneath the waves. Ships were scrambled to the area and were able to rescue 1,252 people. The next morning, the recovery operation began. The waters around the spot where the Gustloff sank were filled with bodies of men, women and children. How many people died will never be known for sure. Historians believe that approximately 85% of the estimated 10,600 people on board lost their lives, so that's approximately 9,000 men, women and children. The commanding officers on board the ship survived, including the Gustloff's captain, Friedrich Petersen, and an investigation was opened about his decision-making leading up to the tragedy. However, this was soon put to one side as the war progressed. The German people were not made aware of the sinking of the Gustloff. The front pages of the newspapers were dominated by propaganda. Even if it had been better publicised, nations by this point had been dealing with death and destruction on a massive scale for over 5 years due to a war that would eventually claim the lives of between 70 and 85 million people by its conclusion. That's approximately 31,731 to 38,531 people per day. There was also little publicity when 11 days later, on the 9th of February 1945, submarine S-13 sank another German ship, the General von Steuben, resulting in the loss of 4,500 souls. Captain Marinesco survived the war and was decorated for his record of enemy kills. Other ships were sunk during Operation Hannibal, including the Goya, a transport ship which was torpedoed on the 16th of April 1945, killing around 7,000 people. Between the start of the operation in January 1945 and May 1945, over 1,500,000 refugees were evacuated from the ports of East Prussia. However, at least 30,000 lost their lives in maritime disasters trying to flee to safety. After several unsuccessful attempts, the wreck of the Wilhelm Gustloff was located by a joint French-American expedition in 1985, around 22 miles off the coast of Libya at a depth of 50 metres, lying on the sea floor. In 1994, the Polish authorities designated the site a war grave and forbid any further expeditions to the wreck out of respect for the dead. And so, the Wilhelm Gustloff remains lying on the sea floor, a permanent reminder of the horror of one of the darkest periods in human history. Thank you for watching. Please like, share and subscribe, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Also, feel free to check out my second channel called Evil Among Us, which focuses on true crime. I'll put a link in the description. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.